Little girl finds buried briefcase in blind millionaire's yard. What she discovers reveals a secret. Where are you watching from? We love seeing how far these stories can reach. Leave your comment and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the upcoming emotional stories that touch the soul. The morning sun filtered through the towering windows of the Rodriguez mansion as Grace Martinez quietly pushed her cleaning cart down the marble hallway. At 39, she had perfected the art of being invisible, a skill essential for someone who cleaned the homes of the ultra-wealthy. Her blonde 7-year-old daughter, Emily, skipped beside her, school bag bouncing against her small frame, her green eyes wide with wonder at the opulent surroundings that had become routine to her mother, but remained magical to her. "Mama, why can't I play in the big yard today?" Emily whispered, her voice echoing slightly in the vast corridor, lined with priceless artwork. She pressed her face to one of the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the sprawling gardens that stretched as far as her young eyes could see. "Because Mr. Rodriguez values his privacy, mija," Grace replied softly, adjusting her starched grey uniform and checking her watch. The mansion employed dozens of staff, but Grace had been specifically requested by Mr. Rodriguez himself after the previous housekeeper had quit without notice. "You can play in the small courtyard while I work, but you must stay where I can see you." Grace had been working for the Rodriguez family for 8 months now, and she still felt overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of wealth surrounding her. Crystal chandeliers that cost more than her annual salary hung from hand-painted ceilings, and Persian rugs worth small fortunes covered floors made of Italian marble. Yet despite all this luxury, the house felt empty, haunted by a tragedy that no amount of money could fix. Ethan Rodriguez sat in his executive study, fingers dancing across the braille display, connected to his state-of-the-art laptop. The room was his sanctuary, filled with tactile objects that helped him navigate his world of perpetual darkness. At 35, he had built a tech empire worth billions, revolutionizing accessibility software and becoming one of the youngest self-made billionaires in American history. But 5 years ago, a car accident had stolen his sight and destroyed everything that mattered to him. The irony wasn't lost on him that the man who had devoted his career to helping disabled people navigate the world had struggled so profoundly to navigate his own darkness. His wife Maria had died on impact that rainy night, and their daughter Isabella, his precious 3-year-old with dark curls and laughing brown eyes, had vanished without a trace from the wreckage. The police had eventually concluded she was dead, her body swept away by the flooding river near the crash site. The case had made national headlines. Tech billionaire loses everything in tragic accident. For months, search teams had combed the riverbanks. Volunteers had distributed missing person flyers, and grief counselors had assured him that closure would come in time. But Ethan had never stopped hoping. Never stopped believing she was out there somewhere, calling for her daddy in a voice he heard in his dreams every night. His fingers paused on the braille display as he heard Grace's gentle knock on the study door. Even without sight, he had learned to read the subtle sounds that revealed people's emotions, and he could hear the slight tension in her movements that meant she was dealing with a problem she wasn't sure how to solve. "Mr. Rodriguez." Grace's gentle voice interrupted his brooding. She stood in the doorway, her cleaning supplies abandoned in the hallway, wringing her hands nervously. "I've brought Emily today. The summer program doesn't start until next week, and my regular babysitter is sick. I hope that's acceptable." Ethan turned toward her voice, his unseeing eyes focusing somewhere over her shoulder. In the months Grace had worked for him, he had come to appreciate her quiet efficiency and the way she never tried to fill the silence with unnecessary chatter. Unlike other employees who seemed uncomfortable around his blindness, Grace treated him with simple dignity. "Of course. Just keep her quiet, please. I have important calls today." "Of course, sir. She's very well behaved, I promise. She brought her colouring books and will stay in the courtyard." Grace hesitated, then added quietly, "She's been asking about the gardens. She's never seen anything so beautiful." Something in Grace's voice made Ethan pause. Perhaps it was the way she spoke about her daughter with such obvious love, or maybe it was the reminder that there were still children in the world who found joy in simple beauty. "She can look at the gardens from the windows," he said after a moment, "but she shouldn't go into the main yard alone." Emily had already spotted something interesting through the window, a small mound of disturbed earth beneath the ancient oak tree in the far corner of the garden. The tree was massive, easily 200 years old, its gnarled branches spreading in a canopy that provided shade for half the back lawn. Something about that particular spot called to her with the irresistible pull that only children feel for secrets waiting to be uncovered. While her mother began dusting the priceless art collection that lined Mr. Rodriguez's study, original Picassos and Monets that Emily couldn't begin to appreciate the value of, Emily slipped through the patio doors that led from the morning room to the gardens. The summer air was warm and sweet against her face, carrying the scent of jasmine and roses from the carefully maintained flower beds. The Rodriguez estate encompassed 12 acres of meticulously landscaped grounds, complete with a fountain that sparkled in the morning sunlight and pathways lined with exotic plants that Grace had told her cost more than their apartment's monthly rent. Emily had always been drawn to mysteries, much to her mother's occasional exasperation. At school, she was the child who noticed when someone was sad before the teachers did, who found lost items that others had given up on, who seemed to have an intuitive understanding of when something was out of place. Her teacher had once told Grace that Emily had an old soul, and Grace had laughed, not realizing how prophetic those words would prove to be. The mysterious mound called to her now with that same intuitive pull. She ran across the perfectly manicured lawn, her small feet barely making a sound on the lush grass. The ancient oak tree loomed above her, its massive trunk scarred with age and weather, its roots creating a natural play area that any child would find irresistible. She knelt beside the disturbed earth, her small hands immediately recognizing that this wasn't natural. Someone had been digging here recently. The soil was loose and darker than the surrounding ground, and there were still faint impressions in the dirt that looked like tool marks. Using a stick she found nearby, Emily began to dig with the focused determination that only children possess when they've discovered something fascinating. The earth was soft and yielding, recently disturbed, as if someone had buried something here not long ago and hadn't expected it to remain hidden forever. Her small hands worked frantically, dirt accumulating under her fingernails as she dug deeper and deeper. She was careful to pile the excavated soil neatly beside the hole. Her mother had taught her to always clean up after herself, even when playing. Then her stick hit something hard with a distinctive metallic sound. "What is this?" she whispered to herself, brushing away the soil with growing excitement. Her heart raced as she realized she had found something significant, something intentionally hidden. A corner of black leather emerged from the earth, expensive-looking and distinctly out of place in a garden setting. Emily's excitement grew as she uncovered more of the object. It was a briefcase, clearly expensive but weathered by time and moisture. The brass corners were tarnished green, and the leather was soft with age, but the quality was unmistakable even to a 7-year-old's eyes. The locks had long since corroded in the damp earth, and with a gentle tug that surprised her with its ease, the latches gave way with a soft click that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet garden. Inside, Emily found treasures that made her gasp in wonder and immediately understand that she had stumbled upon something far more significant than a forgotten toy or lost garden tool. Stacks of money, more than she had ever seen in her 7 years of life, were neatly arranged in one compartment of the briefcase. The bills were pristine, organized with rubber bands, and represented more wealth than her young mind could fully comprehend. But it was the other items that truly captured her attention and would haunt her dreams for years to come. A small pink envelope with "Daddy" written in a child's careful handwriting, purple crayon letters that spoke of love and loss in their innocent imperfection, and nestled beneath it, wrapped carefully in a small blanket, a beautiful porcelain doll with dark curls and a blue dress. The doll was exquisite in a way that spoke of expensive craftsmanship and deep sentimental value. Her painted face was delicate and lifelike, with rosy cheeks and long dark eyelashes that framed brown eyes so realistic they seemed to follow Emily's movements. The blue dress was made of silk, with tiny white flowers embroidered around the collar and hem, and small pearl buttons that caught the morning light. The doll's painted eyes seemed to stare directly at Emily, and she felt an immediate and strange connection to it, as if it had been waiting just for her to find it. She picked up the porcelain figure with trembling fingers, surprised by its weight and the way it seemed to warm in her hands. There was something almost alive about the doll, something that made Emily feel she was holding not just a toy, but a piece of someone's heart. She picked up the envelope next, careful not to damage the precious cargo inside. The paper was construction paper, the kind used in preschools, and the purple crayon had left raised marks that her fingers could trace. Around the word "Daddy," someone had drawn tiny hearts and flowers with the unmistakable enthusiasm of a very young child. "Emily!" Grace's voice echoed across the garden, sharp with worry and growing panic. "Emily, where are you? Answer me right now!" Panic shot through Emily's small body like electricity. She had been caught red-handed, literally, since her hands were now covered in dirt, and she was holding what was clearly someone else's property. Someone's very valuable and very personal property, but something deep inside told her this discovery was important, that it meant something significant that she didn't yet understand, but needed to protect. Quickly, she tried to close the briefcase and cover it with dirt again, but there wasn't enough time, and her small hands were shaking too badly to work efficiently. Grace's footsteps were getting closer, crunching determinedly across the gravel path that led through the rose garden toward the oak tree. "There you are!" Grace appeared around the massive trunk of the oak tree, relief and irritation warring in her expression. Her face was flushed from running through the gardens, and her usually perfect uniform was slightly disheveled from her frantic search. "I told you to stay in the courtyard where I could see you. What on earth are you?" Her words died abruptly as she saw the disturbed earth, the open briefcase lying beside her daughter, and the unmistakable stacks of money visible inside. Grace's face went pale as she took in the scene, her mind immediately jumping to the worst possible conclusions about what this discovery might mean for both their lives. Emily clutched the doll to her chest protectively, the envelope still in her other hand. "Mama, I found treasure," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of excitement and fear. "But it's not regular treasure, it's sad treasure. This doll has been crying." Grace's hands began to shake as she recognized the quality of the briefcase, the substantial amount of money visible inside, and the implications of finding such items buried on her employer's property. This wasn't a child's game or an innocent discovery. This was something serious, something that could get them both into terrible trouble, something that might even be dangerous. "Emily, put those things back right now," Grace commanded, her voice urgent and higher pitched than usual. "We need to cover this up and pretend we never saw it. We need to go back to the house immediately." But Emily shook her head stubbornly, holding the doll tighter against her chest. Something about the porcelain figure felt right in her arms, felt like it belonged with her, or at least belonged somewhere safe where it would be loved and protected. "No, Mama, this doll, she was waiting for me." And look at this letter. It says Daddy on it. Someone wrote to their daddy and buried it here like a time capsule, but it's not old enough to be a real time capsule. Someone put this here recently. Grace's trained eye, sharpened by years of working in wealthy households where she had learned to notice details that others missed, took in the scene more carefully. Emily was right. The money alone represented more than Grace made in several years of cleaning houses. But it wasn't old money. These bills were crisp, some still had that new money feel, and the briefcase, while dirty from its burial, wasn't weathered enough to have been underground for very long. But it was the child's handwriting on the envelope that made her heart skip a beat, and her maternal instincts flare with alarm. There was something heartbreaking about those purple crayon letters, something that spoke of love and loss and desperate hope. "We have to tell Mr. Rodriguez," she whispered, more to herself than to Emily, even as every survival instinct she possessed screamed at her to run, to take Emily, and leave this place before they became entangled in whatever tragedy this briefcase represented. "Tell me what?" Both mother and daughter spun around to find Ethan standing 20 feet away, his guide dog Scout at his side, the German shepherd's intelligent eyes alert and watchful. His acute hearing, honed by 5 years of navigating the world without sight, had led him to their location when he realized Grace wasn't in the house where he'd left her, when the usual sounds of her work had been replaced by an ominous silence. Scout's presence always announced Ethan's approach to those who knew to watch for the dog, but Emily had been too absorbed in her discovery to notice. Now she stared at the imposing figure of Mr. Rodriguez, taking in details she had never noticed before. The way his expensive clothes couldn't hide the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands moved constantly, as if searching for something to hold on to, the way his unseeing eyes seemed to look right through everything around him. Grace scrambled to her feet, instinctively moving to protect Emily, while simultaneously trying to think of a way to explain this situation that wouldn't result in both of them being fired. Or worse. "Mr. Rodriguez, I'm so sorry." Emily wandered off despite my instructions, and she found something buried under your tree. We were just about to cover it back up and pretend we never... What did she find? Ethan's voice was carefully controlled, but Grace could hear the underlying tension that spoke of a man who had learned to expect the worst from life and was rarely disappointed. Emily stood up slowly, still clutching the doll protectively against her chest. Despite her young age, she had inherited her mother's ability to read people, and she could sense that something about this discovery was important to the sad man who lived in this beautiful, empty house. "I found a briefcase with money in this beautiful doll, and a letter that says Daddy on it," she said, in her clear, innocent voice, unaware that her words were about to change everything. The effect on Ethan was immediate and devastating. His face went white, as if all the blood had drained from his body. His knees buckled slightly, and Scout immediately pressed against his leg in the trained response of a guide dog detecting distress in their handler. The word "Daddy" had hit him like a physical blow, bringing back memories of Isabella's sweet voice calling for him in the middle of the night, her small hands reaching for him when thunderstorms scared her, her delighted laughter when he read her favorite bedtime stories. "Describe the doll," he whispered, his voice barely audible, so quiet that Grace had to strain to hear him. Emily looked down at the porcelain figure in her arms, studying it with the careful attention that children give to things they find beautiful. "She has dark, curly hair like mine, when Mama curls it for church on Sundays. She's wearing a blue dress with little white flowers embroidered on it, and she has brown eyes that look so real, it's like she's actually looking at me. She's beautiful, but she looks sad, like she's been waiting a long time for someone to find her and take care of her." Ethan's breathing became labored as Emily's description hit him with the force of a sledgehammer. The description matched perfectly, absolutely perfectly, with Isabella's favorite doll, the one she had named Princess Maria after her mother. the one she had insisted on bringing everywhere, the one that had been with her in the car the night of the accident, the one that had never been found in the wreckage. "Grace," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion that he was struggling to control, "bring me that envelope, please." Grace approached Ethan cautiously, the small pink envelope trembling in her hand like a fragile bird. She had worked for wealthy families long enough to recognize when something monumental was happening, when the carefully constructed facades that protected the ultra-rich from their pain were about to crumble. The way Ethan's entire body had gone rigid, the way his guide dog Scout was pressing closer to his leg in concern, the way the morning air itself seemed to hold its breath, all of it told her this discovery was far more significant than a child's buried treasure. "The envelope is small, child-sized," Grace described softly, her voice instinctively dropping to the gentle tone she used when Emily was upset. "Pink construction paper with little hearts drawn around the edges in purple crayon. The word Daddy is written in the center, in careful letters like a child just learning to write properly. The crayon marks are raised, like she pressed hard to make sure the letters were dark enough." Ethan extended his hand, and Grace gently placed the envelope in his palm. His fingers, so skilled at reading Braille and navigating his world through touch, carefully traced the raised texture left by the crayon marks. Every ridge and valley in the paper told him a story, confirmed what his heart already knew, but his mind was afraid to believe. A sob escaped his throat, raw, broken sound that spoke of 5 years of suppressed grief finally finding its voice. His fingertips followed the careful loops and lines of child's handwriting he had helped guide when Isabella was just learning to hold a crayon properly. "Open it," he whispered, his voice cracking with the weight of hope and terror warring in his chest. "Please, read it to me." Grace looked at Emily, who nodded solemnly, somehow understanding that this moment was sacred, that whatever was in this envelope would change everything for the broken man standing before them. With infinite care, Grace unsealed the envelope, mindful of its obvious age and importance. Inside was a folded piece of construction paper, the kind used in preschools across America, yellow with small flowers printed in the corners. As she unfolded it, Grace gasped at what she saw, her maternal heart breaking for the child who had created this masterpiece of love and the father who was about to receive a message from beyond what he thought was the grave. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "there's a drawing." It's a stick figure of a little girl with dark curly hair and a man with a suit holding hands. There are hearts floating above them like balloons, and a rainbow in the corner with all the colors of the crayon box. At the bottom, in the same purple crayon, it says, "I love you, Daddy, from Isabella Rodriguez. I will find you when I get big enough." The sound that came from Ethan wasn't quite human. It was the cry of a father who had just received a message from his missing child, a sound that contained 5 years of suppressed grief, desperate hope, and love so profound it had survived death itself. He collapsed into a nearby garden chair that Grace quickly pulled behind him, his powerful frame shaking with sobs that had been building for half a decade. Emily watched with wide eyes, not fully understanding the depth of emotion she was witnessing, but knowing instinctively that something very important was happening. She had never seen a grown man cry before, and it frightened and fascinated her in equal measure. She approached Ethan slowly, still holding the doll, her young heart aching for this man whose pain was so visible. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said in her small, clear voice, "is this your little girl's doll?" Ethan lifted his head, tears streaming down his face, carving tracks through the careful composure he maintained in public. "Yes," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "Her name was Isabella. She was 3 years old when I lost her. That doll was her most precious possession. She called her Princess Maria, after her mother. Out to sea, "She's not lost," Emily said with the matter-of-fact certainty that only children possess, the kind of absolute conviction that cuts through adult complications and sees straight to the heart of truth. "She buried her treasure here so you would find it when she came back. That's what I would do if I had to go away from my mama. I would leave her something important so she would know I was still thinking about her." Grace felt her heart breaking for this man who had everything money could buy, but had lost the only thing that truly mattered. She knelt beside Emily, studying the briefcase more carefully now, her practical mind beginning to piece together details that didn't quite fit the story she thought she knew. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said hesitantly, "there's something else here that doesn't make sense. The money in this briefcase, it's not old. These bills are recent, some of them still crisp like they just came from the bank, and the briefcase itself, while dirty from being buried, hasn't been underground for 5 years. The leather would be more deteriorated, the metal would be more corroded." Ethan's head snapped up, his unseeing eyes focusing on Grace's voice with laser intensity. "What are you saying?" Grace's voice grew stronger as the implications hit her, as her years of observing wealthy families and their secrets crystallized into a terrible possibility. "I'm saying someone wanted you to find this. Someone who knew about Isabella, who had access to her things, who could get onto your property without being questioned. So what if Isabella didn't die in that accident? What if someone took her, and now they're trying to tell you something?" The possibility hit Ethan like lightning, illuminating corners of his mind that had been dark for 5 years. He had spent so long grieving, so long believing his daughter was dead, but what if she was alive? What if someone had taken her from the accident scene and kept her hidden all this time? "Who has access to this property?" Grace asked urgently, her investigative instincts now fully engaged. "Who could have buried this without you knowing?" Ethan's mind raced through the possibilities, cataloguing everyone who had keys to the estate, everyone who knew the grounds well enough to bury something without being detected. The list was surprisingly short. His security was extensive, and he trusted very few people with unrestricted access to his private domain. "My sister Carmen has a key to the house. She visits weekly to check on me and handle household matters I can't manage alone," he said slowly, each word feeling heavy with implication. "My business partner David occasionally comes by for meetings, but always with advance notice. The gardening crew works here twice a week, but they've been with me for years and are thoroughly vetted." "When was the last time your sister was here?" Grace pressed, following her instincts down a path that was becoming increasingly dark. "Carmen," he whispered, the name falling from his lips like a stone into still water. "My sister Carmen was here 2 days ago. She said she was checking on the garden maintenance, making sure everything was being properly maintained." Emily tugged on Grace's sleeve, her young mind working through the puzzle with the clarity that comes from not yet learning that some truths are too terrible to speak aloud. "Mama, look at the doll's dress. There's something sewn into it." Grace examined the doll more closely, her fingers finding a small, nearly invisible tear in the seam of the blue silk dress. The stitching was crude, as if someone had opened the seam and then hastily repaired it. Carefully, she worked her finger into the opening and felt something hard and small inside. "There's something here," she said, working carefully to extract the object without damaging the doll further. The silk was delicate, and she could see that this doll had been expensive, the kind of gift that spoke of deep love and substantial means. What emerged was a tiny rolled piece of paper, no bigger than a fortune from a fortune cookie. Grace unrolled it with infinite care, and when she read what was written there in tiny, careful handwriting, her blood ran cold. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "it's an address, 1247 Maple Street, Riverside. And underneath it says, Room 12, ask for Bella. Ethan stood up so quickly that Scout jumped to attention, immediately moving to his side and beginning the practiced routine of guiding a distressed handler. "Riverside is 2 hours from here. Bella." That's what I used to call Isabella when she was very small, before she could pronounce her own name properly. This could be a trap," Grace warned. But even as she said it, she could see the desperate hope building in Ethan's face. Could hear it in the way his breathing had changed from the labored gasps of grief to the quick, shallow breaths of someone preparing for action. "Or it could be my daughter," Ethan replied, his voice strong for the first time since Grace had known him. The broken man who had been grieving for 5 years was transforming before her eyes into someone with purpose, someone with hope, someone with something to fight for. "I have to go there, I have to find out." Emily had been listening to this exchange with growing excitement, her 7-year-old mind already spinning romantic notions of rescue and reunion. "Can we go too? I want to help Isabella come home to her daddy." Grace started to refuse automatically. This was dangerous, possibly illegal, certainly not the kind of situation she should be exposing her daughter to. But Ethan turned toward Emily's voice, his expression thoughtful. "She found the briefcase," he said simply, his logic impeccable in its simplicity. Maybe Isabella wanted Emily to find it. Maybe this little girl is meant to help bring my daughter home. The thought was overwhelming, but Grace found herself nodding despite every rational instinct screaming at her to stay away from this situation. Something about this entire discovery felt destined, as if the universe had conspired to bring Emily to this place on this day to uncover a secret that had been waiting 5 years to be discovered. "We'll go together," Grace said decisively, surprising herself with her own certainty. "But first, we need to think this through. If Isabella is being held by someone, and that someone realizes we're coming with police, they might run with her. We could lose her forever." "No police," Ethan said immediately, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life-changing decisions. "Not yet. If Isabella is there, if she's alive, I won't risk losing her again because we moved too fast." It was dangerous, possibly foolish, but Grace found herself agreeing. The hope in Ethan's voice was so profound, so desperate, that she couldn't bear to be the one to suggest caution when a little girl's life might be at stake. "The address is for a motel," Ethan continued, his mind already working through the logistics with the sharp focus that had made him a billionaire. "Room 12. We'll go this afternoon, during daylight hours when there are people around. If it's dangerous, if anything feels wrong, we leave immediately and call the police." Emily carefully placed the doll back in the briefcase, along with the drawing and envelope, treating each item with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. "Don't worry, Mr. Rodriguez," she said with the absolute confidence of a 7-year-old who had never yet encountered a problem too big for the adults in her life to solve. "We're going to find Isabella and bring her home where she belongs." As Grace looked at this unlikely trio, a blind billionaire whose world had just been turned upside down, a housekeeper whose careful life was about to become infinitely more complicated, and a 7-year-old girl who had unwittingly become the catalyst for what could be either a miraculous reunion or a devastating confirmation of loss, she couldn't help but feel they were about to embark on something that would change all their lives forever. The question that haunted her as they made plans for the afternoon journey was simple and terrifying. Would they find Isabella alive and waiting for rescue? Or would this journey only lead to more heartbreak for a man who had already lost everything that mattered? 3 hours later, Grace sat in the passenger seat of Ethan's luxury SUV, her hands folded tightly in her lap as his driver Marcus navigated the afternoon traffic toward Riverside. The vehicle was a mobile command center, equipped with navigation systems, communication devices, and all the technological assists that made it possible for a blind man to maintain control over his empire. Emily was in the back seat, carefully holding the briefcase on her lap like it contained the most precious treasure in the world, which, Grace was beginning to realize, it very well might. Scout lay at Ethan's feet, the guide dog's intelligent eyes constantly monitoring his master's emotional state. The German shepherd had been with Ethan since shortly after the accident, and Grace could see the deep bond between them. Scout wasn't just a working dog, he was a companion who provided stability in a world that had been turned upside down. "Tell me about the day of the accident," Grace said softly, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over them as the reality of their mission began to sink in. "If someone took Isabella, there might be clues we missed, details that seemed unimportant at the time but make sense now." Ethan's jaw tightened, the muscles working as he prepared to revisit the worst day of his life. When he spoke, his voice was measured and controlled, the tone of someone who had been forced to tell this story many times to police, lawyers, insurance investigators, and grief counselors. "Maria and I were driving back from Isabella's preschool graduation. It was early June, unseasonably rainy for that time of year, and we were running late for dinner with my sister Carmen and her husband at their country club." He paused, his hands clenching and unclenching in his lap as the memories threatened to overwhelm him. Carmen had been acting strange all week, calling constantly, insisting on the dinner, even suggesting she follow us to make sure we arrived safely. Maria thought she was being overprotective, but Carmen said she had a bad feeling about the weather. "What time did the accident happen?" Grace asked gently. "Around 7:30 in the evening. The rain had been getting heavier all day, and there were flash flood warnings for the area near the river. We should have stayed home, should have cancelled dinner, but Carmen had made such a big deal about celebrating Isabella's graduation." His voice carried a note of bitter irony. "She said family was the most important thing in the world." Emily leaned forward from the back seat, her young face serious with concentration. "Mr. Rodriguez, what's the last thing you remember from before the accident?" Ethan turned slightly toward her voice, surprised by the perceptiveness of her question. "I remember Isabella singing in her car seat. She had learned a new song at school that day, something about rainbows and sunshine. Maria was laughing at something Isabella had said about her teacher. The windshield wipers were working overtime, and I remember thinking we should pull over until the rain let up. And then," Grace prompted, "then there was something in the road. A deer, I think, or maybe just a large branch blown down by the wind. I swerved to avoid it, hit a patch of standing water and lost control of the car." His voice became mechanical, reciting facts that had been burned into his memory through countless retellings. "We went through the guardrail and down the embankment toward the river. The last thing I remember was the car rolling, the sound of breaking glass, and Maria screaming." Grace felt a chill run down her spine as she considered the logistics of what had happened next. "When did you wake up in the hospital?" 3 days later. "I had a severe concussion, a crushed vertebra that affected my optic nerve, multiple fractures and internal bleeding. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive." He laughed bitterly. "Lucky. What did the police tell you about Isabella?" "They said they found her car seat, torn from its base by the impact. There was blood, Isabella's blood type, but not enough to indicate she had died in the car. The river was at flood stage that night, running fast and deep. They assumed." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence even 5 years later. "But I learned later that Carmen had arrived at the scene within minutes of the accident. She told police she was driving behind us, worried about the weather, and saw us go off the road." Emily's voice was small but clear. "Mr. Rodriguez, who told you that Isabella was dead?" "The police, the search and rescue teams," Ethan began, then stopped as he realized what Emily was really asking. "But the first person who talked to me about it was Carmen. She came to the hospital as soon as I was conscious enough to understand what had happened. She also had power of attorney and managed Isabella's trust fund as her legal guardian. "What exactly did she say?" Grace asked, her investigative instincts fully engaged now. Ethan's face grew pale as he forced himself to remember those first horrible conversations. She said they had found Maria's body immediately. She had been thrown clear of the car and died instantly. She said Isabella was missing, that they were searching, but that I shouldn't get my hopes up because of the river conditions. And later, Carmen was the one who told me they were calling off the search. She said the police had concluded that Isabella's body had been swept downstream, that it might never be recovered. His voice broke slightly. She held my hand and cried with me. She helped me plan Maria's funeral. She handled all the legal paperwork. Marcus, the driver, had been listening to this conversation with growing concern. "Mr. Rodriguez," he said through the intercom, "I've been working for your family for 15 years. I remember that night. I was the one who drove Miss Carmen to the hospital when she got the call about the accident. What do you remember about her demeanor?" Grace asked quickly. She was upset, of course, but... Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "She was very calm for someone whose brother was dying and whose niece was missing. Very organized, very focused on practical matters. At the time, I thought she was just handling stress by staying busy, but thinking back." "What?" Ethan prompted. "She had a bag with her, an overnight bag, like she was planning to stay at the hospital for several days. But the call had just come in. She wouldn't have had time to pack unless she already knew she would need to stay." The silence in the car was deafening as the implications of Marcus's observations sank in. Grace felt pieces of a horrible puzzle clicking into place in her mind. "Ethan," she said carefully, "who inherited Isabella's trust fund when she was declared dead?" Ethan's face went white as the question hit him like a physical blow. "Carmen. As Isabella's legal guardian in my will, she had access to the inheritance I'd set up for Isabella's future. $12 million, plus control over my assets while I was incapacitated." Emily's sharp intake of breath was audible from the back seat. Even at 7, she understood that $12 million was enough money to make people do terrible things. The silence in the car was oppressive as they all contemplated what this meant. Carmen Rodriguez, Ethan's beloved sister, the woman who had comforted him in his darkest hours and helped him navigate the legal complexities of his tragedy, had had both the opportunity and the motive to orchestrate one of the cruelest deceptions imaginable. "Mr. Rodriguez," Emily said quietly, her young voice cutting through the adult complexities to the heart of the matter. "When you were sick in the hospital, who took care of all your business stuff?" "Carmen had power of attorney. She handled everything while I was recovering from my injuries and learning to cope with my blindness." His voice was hollow as he realized how completely he had been at his sister's mercy during the most vulnerable period of his life. Grace's mind was racing through the implications, cataloguing all the ways Carmen could have manipulated the situation to her advantage. So Carmen identified Maria's body, reported Isabella missing, presumed dead, inherited $25 million, and had complete control over your affairs for months while you recovered. "She also," Ethan said slowly, his voice heavy with growing realization and dawning horror, "insisted on handling all the legal paperwork related to Isabella's presumed death. She said she wanted to spare me the pain of dealing with it myself. She filed all the insurance claims, handled the probate issues, managed the trust fund transfers." Marcus cleared his throat. "Mr. Rodriguez, we're approaching Riverside. What exactly are we walking into here?" Ethan straightened in his seat, his resolve hardening despite the emotional turmoil of the revelations about his sister. "We're walking into the possibility that my sister has been holding my daughter captive for 5 years, while stealing her inheritance and lying to me about her death." "And if that's true," Marcus asked, his concern evident in his voice, "Then we're about to tear apart my family to save what's left of it," Ethan replied grimly, his voice carrying the determination of a man who had already lost everything once and refused to lose it again. The Riverside Motel was exactly what Grace had expected, a run-down establishment on the outskirts of town where people came when they didn't want to be found. The neon sign flickered intermittently, several letters burned out, and the parking lot was cracked and weedy. This was the kind of place where cash was preferred and questions weren't asked. "I don't like this," Marcus said, surveying the area with the trained eye of someone responsible for a billionaire's security. "This place looks like trouble. There are too many blind spots, too many ways for this to go wrong." "Nakum, we're not here to like it," Ethan said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that others questioned. "We're here to find my daughter." Emily pressed her face to the window, studying the motel with the intensity of a detective studying a crime scene. "Look, there's room 12. The curtains are closed, but there's a light on inside, and look, there's a shadow moving around." Grace felt her heart hammering as they parked near the motel office, away from the direct line of sight of room 12. "What's our plan? We can't just knock on the door and ask if they're holding a kidnapped child." "Actually," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to attempt, "that's exactly what we're going to do. Emily found that address for a reason. If Isabella is in there, if she's alive and waiting, then we need to approach this directly. Any attempt at subterfuge could backfire if Carmen panics." They made an unlikely group walking across the motel parking lot. A blind billionaire with his guide dog, a nervous housekeeper, and a determined 7-year-old clutching a briefcase that contained the key to 5 years of deception. Grace could feel eyes watching them from behind various curtained windows, and she wondered how many of the motel's other guests were also hiding from something or someone. As they approached room 12, Emily suddenly grabbed Grace's arm with surprising strength. "Mama, listen," she whispered urgently. From inside the room came the faint sound of a television, some afternoon talk show playing at low volume. But underneath it, barely audible through the thin walls, was something else. A child's voice, singing softly to herself. The melody was simple and sweet, the kind of song a little girl might sing while playing alone, trying to comfort herself in an unfamiliar place. Ethan froze, his entire body going rigid as he strained to hear every note. "That's Isabella's song," he whispered, tears flowing freely down his face for the second time that day. "She used to sing that to her dolls every night before bed. I taught it to her when she was just learning to talk." Grace felt the ground shift beneath her feet as the reality of the situation hit her with full force. Isabella was alive. She was in that room, just 20 feet away from her father, who had grieved for her for 5 years. The little girl whose drawings and letters had broken their hearts that morning was alive and singing, completely unaware that her rescue was finally at hand. "What do we do now?" Grace whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. Ethan stepped forward with the decisive movements of a man who had made his choice and would not be deterred. He raised his hand and knocked gently on the door, 3 soft taps that sounded like thunder in the quiet afternoon air. "Isabella," he called softly, his voice carrying all the love and longing of 5 years of separation. "Isabella, it's Daddy." The singing stopped immediately, as if a switch had been thrown. There was the sound of rapid movement inside, footsteps, and then a child's voice, older now, changed by 5 years of growth, but unmistakably familiar to Ethan's ears. "Daddy? Is that really you?" The door handle turned with a sound like destiny clicking into place, and Grace held her breath as the most important reunion of Ethan's life was about to unfold. But when the door opened, it wasn't 8-year-old Isabella who appeared in the doorway. It was Carmen Rodriguez, Ethan's sister, her usually perfect appearance disheveled, and her face white with shock and terror at being discovered in the one place she thought she was safe. "Hello, Ethan," she said, her voice shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. "I suppose it's time we talked." Carmen Rodriguez stood in the doorway of room 12, her usually perfect appearance disheveled and her hands shaking visibly. At 42, she had spent her entire adult life living in the shadow of her younger brother's extraordinary success, watching him accumulate wealth and recognition, while she remained the forgotten older sister, married to a successful but unremarkable surgeon. Now that shadow had finally caught up with her, and there was nowhere left to run. "Carmen," Ethan said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and growing anger that vibrated through his entire body. "Where is my daughter?" Before Carmen could formulate an answer that might somehow explain away 5 years of deception, a small figure appeared behind her in the darkened room. Isabella Rodriguez, now 8 years old, stepped hesitantly into the light of the doorway. She had grown taller, her baby features had sharpened into those of a young girl, but her dark curls and brown eyes were unmistakably the same, older, sadder, but undeniably the child Ethan had lost 5 years ago. "Daddy." Isabella's voice was uncertain, tinged with 5 years of confusion and longing, hope and fear warring in her tone. "Aunt Carmen said you didn't want me anymore because I couldn't help you when you got hurt. She said you blamed me for making Mama go to heaven." The lie hit Ethan like a physical blow that nearly drove him to his knees. The cruelty of it was breathtaking, to tell a child that her father, the man who had loved her more than life itself, blamed her for her mother's death. He dropped to his knees in the motel parking lot, his arms reaching toward the sound of his daughter's voice with desperate urgency. "Isabella, baby, that's not true." "None of that is true," he said, his voice breaking with emotion that had been building for 5 years. "I've been looking for you every single day since the accident. I never stopped wanting you. I never stopped loving you. You are the most important thing in my world, and losing you nearly destroyed me." Emily stepped forward, still clutching the briefcase that had started this incredible day. Her young heart was breaking for both father and daughter, and she did what children do naturally. She tried to fix things. "Isabella, I found your treasure under the oak tree. I found your letter to your daddy and your beautiful doll that you buried, so he would know you were still thinking about him." Isabella's eyes widened as she recognized the briefcase, her face lighting up with something approaching hope for the first time in years. "You found it." "I buried it there the night Aunt Carmen said we had to leave because Daddy was too sick to take care of me. I wanted to leave him something so he would know I still loved him, even if I couldn't come home." Grace watched this reunion with tears streaming down her face, her maternal heart breaking for the years of separation and lies that had kept this family apart. But she was also watching Carmen, studying the woman's reactions and body language with the sharp observational skills she had developed over years of working in wealthy households where secrets and lies were often currency. Carmen's face was a mask of desperation and guilt, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her like a house of cards in a hurricane. "Ethan, you don't understand," she began, her voice shaking as she struggled to find words that could somehow justify the unjustifiable. "You were so badly hurt, so lost after the accident. Maria was dead. You were blind. You could barely function, I thought. I thought Isabella would be better off believing her father abandoned her," Grace interrupted, her voice sharp with righteous anger. "Better off being stolen from her family and hidden away in places like this? Better off thinking the man who loved her more than life itself blamed her for her mother's death? It wasn't supposed to be permanent," Carmen protested, tears streaming down her face as the weight of 5 years of deception finally crushed her composure. "The night of the accident, I got to the scene before the ambulances arrived. I found Isabella thrown clear of the car, unconscious but alive. Maria was already dead, and you were dying, and I thought, I thought it would be easier for everyone if Isabella was presumed dead too. Ethan's voice was deadly quiet, more terrifying in its control than any shout could have been. Easier for who, Carmen? Easier for you to access her trust fund? I was protecting her, Carmen shouted, her facade finally cracking completely. You were blind, broken, grieving. You could barely take care of yourself, let alone a traumatized 3-year-old. You were talking about suicide, Ethan. You said you wanted to die and be with Maria. How could I give Isabella back to a man who wanted to kill himself? The accusation hung in the air like poison, and Grace could see how Carmen had rationalized her actions, how she had convinced herself that stealing a child and faking her death was somehow an act of mercy. But she could also see the holes in Carmen's logic, the way self-interest had twisted her reasoning. But something changed recently, Grace observed. Why did you bury that briefcase now after 5 years? Why give Ethan clues to find Isabella? Carmen's shoulders sagged with defeat. Because I was running out of money and options. My ex-husband was getting suspicious about my expenses. Investigators were starting to ask questions about Isabella's trust fund. I was planning to disappear with Isabella permanently, maybe Mexico or South America, where the money would last longer. But I couldn't bear the thought of Ethan spending the rest of his life wondering what happened to her. The briefcase was my way of giving him closure, letting him know she had lived, that she loved him. Carmen's face flushed red with shame and anger. I used that money to take care of her. Do you think hiding a child for 5 years is free? I've moved constantly, changed identities, paid for private schools, medical care, everything she needed. You've moved constantly because you were running from the law, Grace countered. And I'm willing to bet that $25 million went a lot further toward funding your lifestyle than it did toward Isabella's care. Isabella had been listening to this adult conversation with the intensity of a child, trying to understand how her world had been built on lies. Aunt Carmen, she said in her clear young voice, you told me Daddy was dead too. You said he died in the hospital because he was too sad about losing me and Mama. Maid. The final piece of Carmen's cruelty was revealed, and Ethan felt something break inside him that he wasn't sure could ever be repaired. Not only had Carmen stolen his daughter and let him grieve for 5 years, she had stolen his daughter's father from her as well, leaving Isabella believing she was completely alone in the world, except for the aunt who had rescued her. Isabella, Ethan said gently, extending his arms toward her. Come here, sweetheart. Let Daddy hold you. Isabella looked uncertainly between her father and her aunt, 5 years of careful manipulation warring with the deep love she still felt for the man who had sung her to sleep every night for the first 3 years of her life. The little girl in her wanted to run to her father, but 5 years of being told he didn't want her had left scars that wouldn't heal instantly. Emily made the decision for her. She walked over to Isabella and took her hand with the natural confidence of a 7-year-old who had never learned that some problems were too big to solve. It's okay, she said with absolute certainty. I can tell when grown-ups are lying, and your daddy isn't lying. He really, really loves you. Look how much he's crying just from seeing you again. The simple honesty of another child was exactly what Isabella needed. She broke away from Carmen and ran to Ethan, throwing her small arms around his neck with a force that nearly knocked him over. The embrace they shared was 5 years in the making, filled with love and loss and desperate gratitude that they had found each other again. I'm so sorry, Daddy. Isabella sobbed against his shoulder. I wanted to come home, but Aunt Carmen said you didn't want a broken family anymore. She said you had a new life, and I would just remind you of sad things. You are not broken, Ethan whispered fiercely, holding her tight enough to convince himself she was real. You are perfect, and you are my daughter, and I have missed you every single day since the accident. There is nothing in this world more important to me than you." Carmen watched this reunion with a mixture of guilt and desperation, realizing that her carefully constructed justifications were crumbling in the face of the obvious love between father and daughter. "Ethan, please, you have to understand what I understand," Ethan said, standing with Isabella still in his arms, "is that you stole 5 years from both of us. You stole her childhood and my chance to be her father during some of the most important years of her life. You let me believe my daughter was dead while you convinced her that I didn't love her." Marcus had been standing guard near the car during this emotional confrontation, but he approached now with his phone in hand. "Mr. Rodriguez, should I call the police? This is kidnapping, fraud, theft. Carmen could be facing decades in prison." Ethan looked down at Isabella, who was clinging to him, as if she was afraid he might disappear if she let go. "What do you think, sweetheart? Do you want to press charges against Aunt Carmen?" Isabella considered this question with the seriousness of someone far older than her 8 years, someone who had been forced to grow up too quickly in a world built on lies. "Will it bring back the 5 years we lost?" "No, baby, it won't." "Will it make you not be blind anymore?" "No, sweetheart." "Then I just want to go home with you." "I want to sleep in my old room and have you read me stories again and teach me new songs." She paused, then added with the devastating honesty of childhood, "I want to stop being scared all the time." Carmen collapsed against the motel room doorframe, the weight of her actions finally crushing her completely. "I never meant for it to go on this long," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "At first, I thought it was temporary, just until you got better. But as the years passed, it became easier to keep the lie going than to face what I had done." Grace stepped closer to Carmen, her voice stern but not unkind. "Where have you been keeping her all this time? What kind of life has Isabella been living?" "Different places," Carmen admitted, her composure completely shattered. "Hotels, rental houses, sometimes staying with people I paid to keep quiet. I told Isabella we were traveling because I was researching a book, that we needed to see different places. I homeschooled her using Isabella Martinez's identity. Complete with birth certificate and social security number, I paid $50,000 for. I even told the police I had arrived at the accident scene 10 minutes after it happened, that Good Samaritans had called me when they saw our family emergency contact information." Accept the truth," Grace interrupted. "Accept stability, accept the father who loved her, accept the chance to grieve properly for her mother." "She's had a good life," Carmen protested weakly, but even she seemed to know how hollow the words sounded. Isabella lifted her head from Ethan's shoulder to look at her aunt. "I've been lonely," she said simply. "Every day I've been lonely. You wouldn't let me make friends because you said we were always moving. You wouldn't let me talk about Daddy or Mama because you said it made you too sad. I've been lonely for 5 years." The indictment was devastating in its simplicity. Carmen had given Isabella material comfort, but had starved her of the emotional connections that children need to thrive. She had isolated her from everything and everyone who might have helped her heal from the trauma of losing her mother and being separated from her father. "Isabella," Emily said, still holding the briefcase, "do you want to see your doll? I took really good care of her while I was looking for you." Isabella's face lit up with genuine joy for the first time since they had found her. "Princess Maria? You have Princess Maria?" Emily carefully opened the briefcase and lifted out the porcelain doll, its blue dress still pristine, its painted eyes still bright and lifelike. Isabella gasped and reached for the doll with trembling hands. "She looks exactly the same," Isabella whispered, cradling the doll against her chest. "I was so scared Aunt Carmen wouldn't let me take her when we left the hospital. She's been waiting for me all this time." Grace watched this exchange with a growing understanding of what Isabella's life had been like for the past 5 years. Carmen had stripped away everything familiar, everything that connected Isabella to her previous life and her family, leaving her completely dependent on the woman who had kidnapped her. "Carmen," Grace said quietly, "you need to understand that what you did was wrong, regardless of your motivations. You traumatized a child and nearly destroyed her father. The least you can do now is tell us everything, where you've been, how you've been living, whether there's anyone else involved in this." Carmen looked around the group, at Ethan holding his daughter, at Grace standing protective and angry, at Emily clutching the evidence of her crimes, at Marcus documenting everything with his phone, and seemed to realize that her 5-year deception was finally over. "There's no one else," she said dully. "I've been alone with this secret for 5 years. The money is mostly gone. Creating false identities cost me over $2 million alone. Birth certificates, social security cards, passports, medical records for Isabella under the name Bella Martinez. Then constant moving, bribing motel managers and landlords who didn't ask questions, private tutors who worked for cash. I've been living in places like this for the past year because I was down to my last few $100,000. "What about your husband?" Grace asked. "What does he think you've been doing all this time?" We divorced 3 years ago," Carmen admitted. "He thought I was having a breakdown after the accident, spending money we didn't have on therapy and travel. He never knew about Isabella." The picture that emerged was of a woman who had made an impulsive decision in a moment of crisis and then found herself trapped by the consequences, watching her life unravel as she struggled to maintain an impossible lie. "The question now," Grace said practically, "is what we do next. Isabella needs stability. She needs therapy to help her process what's happened, and she needs time to readjust to being with her father." Ethan nodded, his mind already working through the logistics of rebuilding their lives together. "We'll go home," he said simply. "We'll go home and start over." Isabella looked up at him with hope shining in her eyes. "Will you teach me about being blind? I want to help you the way Scout helps you." The offer, so innocent and loving, broke something loose in Ethan's chest. "Sweetheart, you don't need to take care of me. I need to take care of you." "But we can take care of each other," Isabella said, with the wisdom of a child who had learned to navigate a complicated world. "That's what families do, right?" As Grace watched this father and daughter begin to rebuild their relationship, she felt something shifting in her own heart. She looked at Ethan, really looked at him, and saw not just a wealthy employer, but a man of strength and character who had survived unimaginable loss with grace. She saw a father whose love for his daughter was so profound it had sustained him through 5 years of grief. She saw someone she could respect, someone she could care about, someone who might be worth taking a risk on. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said quietly, "Isabella is going to need time to adjust, and you're going to need help navigating this transition. If you'd like, Emily and I could stay at the house for a while, help Isabella settle in." Ethan turned toward her voice, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw hope in his unseeing eyes. "Grace," he said, "I don't think I could do this without you. Both of you. You've already done so much for us." Emily looked between the adults, her 7-year-old mind already spinning romantic possibilities. "Does this mean Isabella and I can be sisters?" The question hung in the air, full of potential and promise, as this unlikely family began to imagine what their future might hold together. The drive back to the Rodriguez mansion was unlike anything Grace had ever experienced. Isabella sat curled in Ethan's lap, 5 years of separation, making it impossible for either of them to let go of physical contact. She chattered constantly, as if trying to fill 5 years of silence with words, telling her father about books she had read, places Carmen had taken her, dreams she had dreamed about coming home. Emily sat beside them, holding Princess Maria and asking Isabella dozens of questions about life on the road with Aunt Carmen. The two girls were already bonding with the quick intimacy that only children can achieve, comparing favorite colors and discussing whether they would share a room or have separate bedrooms in the big house. Carmen rode in Marcus's security vehicle, following behind them. She had agreed to come voluntarily to help with Isabella's transition and to begin the legal process of untangling 5 years of fraud and deception. The fight had gone out of her completely once Isabella had chosen her father over her lies. "Daddy," Isabella said, tracing patterns on Ethan's hand with her small finger, "will you tell me about what happened to your eyes? Aunt Carmen said it was because you were sad about losing me and Mama, but that doesn't make sense." Grace watched Ethan consider how to explain his blindness to an 8-year-old in a way that was honest but not traumatic. "In the car accident, I hit my head very hard," he said carefully. "The doctors call it optic nerve damage. It means the part of my brain that helps me see got hurt and can't work anymore." "Does it hurt?" "No, sweetheart, it doesn't hurt. It just means I experience the world differently now. I use my other senses more: hearing, touch, smell, and Scout helps me navigate places I haven't been before." Isabella considered this seriously. "I think I have good hearing too. When we lived in hotels, I could always tell when Aunt Carmen was upset because her breathing would change, even when she was trying to pretend everything was fine." The observation was remarkably perceptive for an 8-year-old, and Grace realized that Isabella had developed heightened sensitivity to emotional cues during her years of uncertainty and instability. She had learned to read the adults around her as a survival skill. "Isabella," Grace said gently, "when you lived with Aunt Carmen, did she ever hurt you or make you do things you didn't want to do?" Isabella shook her head immediately. "No, she never hurt me. She was always nice to me. She was always sad and scared. She would cry sometimes when she thought I was asleep, and she was always worried about money and about people finding us." This picture of Carmen as a woman trapped by her own deception rather than a calculating villain made Grace's feelings about the situation more complicated. Carmen had committed terrible crimes, but she hadn't been cruel to Isabella in an obvious way. Her cruelty had been subtler, built into the very foundation of lies upon which she had constructed Isabella's life. "Did you ever try to contact your father?" Grace asked. "Aunt Carmen said he was dead," Isabella replied matter-of-factly. "She showed me newspaper articles about the accident that said there were no survivors. She said it would be dangerous for us to stay in one place because people might try to hurt us if they knew who I really was." Ethan's jaw tightened as he realized the full scope of Carmen's manipulation. She had shown Isabella fake newspaper articles to support her lies, and had used fear to keep Isabella compliant and isolated. As they approached the estate, Isabella pressed her face to the window with growing excitement. "It looks exactly the same," she breathed. "The fountain is still there, and the rose garden, and my oak tree." "Your oak tree?" Emily asked. "That's where I used to play. Daddy built me a swing on one of the low branches, and I had a little garden underneath where I grew flowers for Mama." Isabella's voice grew sad. "I hope the swing is still there." Grace felt her heart breaking for this little girl who had lost so much and was trying so hard to find pieces of her old life in the place she was finally coming home to. "I'm sure your daddy will show you everything that's still the same and help you make new memories for the things that have changed." "Dee!" When they pulled into the circular driveway, Isabella gasped with delight. "Scout, do you remember me?" she called to the guide dog, who had lifted his head at the sound of a child's voice. Scout's tail began wagging immediately, his body language indicating recognition and excitement. Guide dogs were trained to be reserved and focused, but Scout clearly remembered the little girl who had been part of his master's life before his training began. "He remembers you," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "Dogs never forget the people they love." As they entered the house, Isabella's excitement was palpable but tinged with uncertainty. Everything was familiar yet different, smaller than her 3-year-old memory had made it, but still magnificent to her 8-year-old eyes. "Mrs. Chen!" Isabella called out as the elderly housekeeper appeared in the foyer. Mrs. Chen had worked for the Rodriguez family for 20 years, and she had been devastated by Isabella's presumed death. "Miss Isabella," Mrs. Chen said, tears streaming down her face, "we never stopped hoping you would come home." The reunion was emotional but brief. Isabella was overwhelmed by the number of people and the intensity of emotions swirling around her. Grace recognized the signs of a child reaching her limit and gently suggested that Isabella might want to see her room. "Is it still the same?" Isabella asked as they climbed the grand staircase. "We haven't changed anything," Ethan assured her. "Mrs. Chen has kept it exactly as it was." When they opened the door to Isabella's bedroom, the little girl gasped in wonder. The room was a perfect shrine to the 3-year-old she had been. Princess bed with pink canopy, toy chest full of dolls and games, bookshelf lined with picture books, and walls covered with artwork she had created in preschool. "My drawings," Isabella whispered, approaching the wall where her crayon masterpieces were still displayed in expensive frames. "You kept my drawings." "I kept everything," Ethan said simply. "I couldn't bear to change anything because I kept hoping you would come home." Isabella climbed onto her bed, which had been too big for her at 3, but was now just the right size for her 8-year-old frame. She picked up a stuffed elephant that had been her second favorite toy after Princess Maria. "Mr. Peanuts," she said softly, hugging the well-worn elephant. "I missed you too." Emily explored the room with obvious envy. "You have so many toys," she said wistfully, "and your own bathroom with a pink bathtub." "You can play with anything you want," Isabella offered immediately. "And maybe Daddy will let you stay in the guest room next door so we can be like sisters." Grace felt her carefully constructed boundaries beginning to blur as she watched her daughter interacting with Isabella and Ethan. She had come to work as a housekeeper, but she was finding herself drawn into this family's story in ways that were both wonderful and terrifying. "Grace," Ethan said quietly, "could I speak with you privately?" They stepped out onto the balcony that adjoined Isabella's room, leaving the girls to explore toys and reconnect with forgotten treasures. The evening air was warm and sweet with the scent of jasmine, and Grace could hear the fountain splashing in the garden below. "I need to ask you something," Ethan said, his voice serious. "Isabella is going to need stability and continuity as she adjusts to being home. She's already bonded with Emily, and I can see that she trusts you. Would you consider staying here permanently, not as a housekeeper, but as part of our family?" Grace felt her breath catch in her throat. "Ethan, I know it's a lot to ask," he continued quickly. "I know we barely know each other, and I know the circumstances are complicated. But Isabella needs someone who understands children, someone who can help her process what she's been through. And Emily needs stability too. She could have the education and opportunities here that you might not be able to provide on your own." Grace looked through the window at their daughters, who were already planning adventures and sharing secrets like sisters who had known each other forever. "What exactly are you asking?" Ethan turned toward her voice, his unseeing eyes finding her face with uncanny accuracy. "I'm asking if you would consider building a life here with us. Isabella needs a mother figure, and Emily could have a father figure. We could be a family, all of us together." The proposal was overwhelming in its implications. Grace had been supporting herself and Emily on her own for 7 years, never allowing herself to depend on anyone else, never trusting that someone else's promises would prove reliable. But looking at Ethan, seeing the depth of his love for Isabella and the way he had already begun, including Emily in his plans, she felt something shifting in her heart. "I need to think about it," she said quietly. This is a lot to process in one day. Of course, Ethan agreed. Take all the time you need. But Grace, I want you to know that what I'm feeling isn't just gratitude for what you've done today. You've brought light back into this house, into our lives, you and Emily both. Before Grace could respond, Isabella appeared in the doorway. Daddy, I'm hungry. Could Mrs. Chen make my favorite dinner? Do you remember what it was? Do spaghetti and meatballs with extra cheese, Ethan replied immediately, his face lighting up with joy at this simple request for normalcy. And garlic bread, Isabella added, with the crusts cut off. And garlic bread with the crusts cut off, Ethan confirmed. Some things never change. As they prepared for their first family dinner in 5 years, Grace felt herself being pulled deeper into the warm circle of the Rodriguez family. She watched Ethan helping Isabella wash her hands, listened to Emily chattering about all the things she wanted to show Isabella in the garden, and found herself imagining what it would be like to belong here permanently. The dining room had been set for 4, with Isabella in her old booster seat, and Emily beside her in a chair that Mrs. Chen had found in storage. The conversation was a mixture of catching up on 5 years and planning for the future, punctuated by Isabella's observations about how different everything looked from an 8-year-old's perspective rather than a 3-year-old's. Daddy, Isabella said as they finished dessert, can I ask you something important? Of course, sweetheart. Are you going to marry Grace so Emily can be my real sister? The question caught both adults completely off guard. Grace felt her face flame red, while Ethan nearly choked on his coffee. Isabella, Grace said gently, that's not how families work. People don't get married just so children can be sisters. Nah, but you could get married because you love each other, Isabella said with the relentless logic of childhood. And then Emily and I would be sisters as a bonus. Emily giggled at this reasoning. Do you love my mama? She asked Ethan with 8-year-old directness. Ethan's face grew serious as he considered how to answer honestly without overwhelming anyone. I think your mama is an amazing woman, he said carefully. She's smart and kind and brave, and she's raised a wonderful daughter. But love is something that grows over time between people who really know each other. So you could love her eventually. Isabella pressed. Isabella, Grace intervened, that's enough questions about grown-up things. Why don't you and Emily go upstairs and get ready for bed? As the girls headed upstairs, chattering about sleeping arrangements and tomorrow's plans, Grace and Ethan were left alone with the weight of Isabella's observations hanging between them. She's not wrong, Ethan said quietly. There is something between us, isn't there? Grace felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. Ethan, this day has been overwhelming for all of us. We shouldn't make any decisions based on heightened emotions and extraordinary circumstances. You're right, he agreed. But Grace, I want you to know that my offer stands. Whatever happens between us personally, you and Emily have a place here for as long as you want it. Looking at this man who had lost everything and found the strength to rebuild, who loved his daughter enough to forgive the sister who had stolen her, who had opened his home and heart to a housekeeper and her daughter without a second thought, Grace felt herself falling for him despite every rational reason to be cautious. I'll stay, she said quietly. For now, I'll stay and see how things develop. The relief and joy on Ethan's face was answer enough to her doubts. Whatever happened next, they would face it together as a family that had been brought together by tragedy, but bonded by love and hope for the future. 6 months later, Grace woke up on Christmas morning to the sound of children's laughter echoing through the Rodriguez mansion. Isabella and Emily had become inseparable sisters in every way that mattered, their bond forged through shared adventures, whispered secrets, and the security of finally belonging somewhere permanent. Grace smiled as she heard them racing down the hallway toward the stairs, their excited voices carrying clearly through the house that had once been so quiet and sad. "Daddy! Grace, come see what Santa brought!" The transformation of both children over the past months had been remarkable to witness. Isabella had blossomed under the security of being home with her father, her confidence growing daily as she rediscovered the house she remembered and claimed new spaces as her own. The 8-year-old, who had been suspicious and guarded, was now vibrant and outgoing, making friends at her new school and excelling in art classes where she could express years of suppressed emotions through color and creativity. Emily had adapted to their new life with the resilience that children possess, trading her small apartment for a mansion, but never losing the down-to-earth perspective that Grace had worked so hard to instill in her. She had started piano lessons, joined the school's advanced reading program, and appointed herself as Isabella's official protector and best friend. Grace had evolved from housekeeper to family member gradually and naturally, her role shifting as Ethan came to rely on her judgment about Isabella's needs and her insight into the daily rhythms of family life. They had been careful not to rush into anything romantic, both understanding that Isabella's adjustment had to be their first priority. But over the months, as they worked together to help Isabella heal from 5 years of displacement and lies, Grace and Ethan had discovered a partnership that went far beyond shared responsibility for the children. They found themselves talking late into the evening after the girls were asleep, sharing stories about their pasts, their hopes for the future, their dreams for the children they were raising together. Ethan had been remarkably patient with Isabella's adjustment, understanding that trust needed to be rebuilt slowly. There had been difficult moments, nightmares about being taken away again, anxiety about whether her father would still want her when she wasn't perfect, moments of missing Carmen despite everything that had happened. Carmen herself was serving a reduced sentence in minimum security prison, having pleaded guilty to kidnapping and fraud charges in exchange for cooperation and psychological evaluation. Isabella visited her once a month, supervised visits that Dr. Martinez, Isabella's therapist, believed were important for closure and healing. Carmen was getting therapy too, working to understand how grief and jealousy had driven her to make such devastating choices. "Grace!" Isabella called from downstairs. "Daddy says we can't open presents until everyone is here." Grace laughed and reached for her robe, catching sight of herself in the mirror as she did. The past 6 months had changed her too. The constant stress and uncertainty that had marked her life as a single mother were gone, replaced by the glow that comes from feeling secure and loved. She found Ethan in the kitchen, already dressed and making coffee with the practiced efficiency he had developed over years of navigating his world without sight. Scout lay by his feet, occasionally lifting his head to monitor the excited children racing around the Christmas tree in the adjacent living room. "Good morning," Ethan said, turning toward her voice with the smile that had become her favorite sight in the world. "I was going to bring you coffee in bed, but the girls had other plans." "I can hear that," Grace laughed, accepting the perfectly prepared cup with gratitude. "How long have they been up?" "About an hour. They came to my room at dawn, whispering loudly about whether Santa had really come, whether he'd found the house okay, whether he'd known Isabella was back." Ethan's voice was warm with contentment. "I think this is the first Christmas either of them has had where they felt completely secure." Grace nodded, watching through the doorway as Isabella and Emily arranged and rearranged presents under the tree, their faces bright with anticipation. "They're so happy, both of them." "What about you?" Ethan asked, moving closer to her. "Are you happy?" The question was loaded with months of unspoken feelings, careful courtship, and growing love that they had both been afraid to name directly. Grace looked at this man who had given her and Emily a family, who had trusted her with his daughter's heart, who had shown her what it felt like to be cherished rather than merely needed. "I'm happier than I ever thought possible," she said honestly. "Grace," Ethan said, his voice suddenly serious, There's something I want to ask you, but I want to do it properly." Before she could respond, he was reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small velvet box. Grace's breath caught in her throat as he dropped to one knee in the middle of the kitchen, his unseeing eyes finding her face with the accuracy that love had taught him. "Grace Martinez," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was asking, "you brought light back into my life when I thought I would never see anything beautiful again. You gave me back my daughter and showed me that families can be built on love rather than just biology. Will you marry me and make our family official?" "Daddy!" Isabella's voice came from the doorway, where both girls stood watching with wide eyes and barely contained excitement. "Are you asking Grace to marry us?" "I'm asking Grace to marry me," Ethan corrected gently. "But yes, that would make us all a family legally as well as in our hearts." Grace looked at the ring in the box, a stunning solitaire that caught the morning light and threw rainbows across the kitchen walls. Then at the man kneeling before her, then at the two little girls whose faces were bright with hope. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Yes, I'll marry you. I'll—" The eruption of joy from Isabella and Emily was immediate and overwhelming. They rushed into the kitchen, throwing their arms around both adults and creating a laughing, crying, hugging pile of family happiness. "This is the best Christmas present ever," Isabella declared. "Now Emily will really be my sister forever. And Grace will be my new mama," Emily added, "and Mr. Rodriguez will be my papa." As Ethan slipped the ring onto Grace's finger, she felt the last of her carefully constructed walls crumble completely. This man, this house, these children, they had become her world, her family, her future. "I love you," she whispered to Ethan as the girls raced back to the living room to announce the engagement to Scout and Mrs. Chen. "I love you too," he replied, standing to kiss her properly for the first time since they had met. "I love you, and I love Emily, and I love the family we're building together." The Christmas morning that followed was magical in the way that only comes when love has triumphed over loss. They opened presents and cooked breakfast together, played games and called relatives to share their news, took photos and made memories that would last forever. But the most meaningful moment came in the afternoon when Isabella asked to visit her mother's grave. They drove to the cemetery together, all four of them, carrying flowers that Isabella had picked from the garden. "Mama," Isabella said, kneeling beside Maria Rodriguez's headstone, "I want you to meet Grace and Emily. Grace is going to marry Daddy, and Emily is going to be my sister. I think you would like them. Grace takes good care of Daddy the way you did, and Emily makes me laugh the way you used to." Grace felt tears flowing down her face as she listened to Isabella talking to her mother, including Maria in their new family configuration with the natural grace that children possess for accepting love in all its forms. "I know you can't come to the wedding," Isabella continued, "but I'll carry some of your flowers so you'll be there with us anyway, and I'll take care of Daddy for you, I promise." Ethan knelt beside his daughter, one hand on her shoulder and the other reaching for Grace. "I think Mama would be very happy that we found Grace and Emily," he said softly. "She always said that love multiplies rather than divides. The more people we love, the more love we have to give." As they drove home from the cemetery, Isabella and Emily chatted excitedly about wedding plans, bridesmaid dresses, and whether Scout could be the ring bearer. Grace listened to their happy voices and marveled at how completely her life had changed in the span of one day. A year ago, she had been a struggling single mother cleaning houses and worrying about Emily's future. Today, she was engaged to a man she loved deeply, raising two daughters in a house filled with laughter and music, planning a wedding that would celebrate not just their love, but the miraculous second chances that had brought them all together. The briefcase that Emily had found under the oak tree sat in Ethan's study now, a reminder of the day their lives had intersected and created something beautiful from the ashes of old tragedies. Isabella's letter to her daddy was framed on the mantel, and Princess Maria sat on the bookshelf, watching over a family that had been broken and made whole again. That evening, as Grace tucked both girls into Isabella's room, where they had decided to have a sleepover to celebrate the engagement, Emily looked up at her with serious 7-year-old eyes. "Mama, do you think Isabella's treasure brought us all together on purpose?" Grace considered the question, thinking about the chain of events that had led from Emily's discovery to this moment of complete happiness. "I think sometimes the universe has plans for us that we don't understand until later," she said carefully. "I think Isabella's love for her father was so strong that it found a way to bring them back together, and maybe it brought us together too. I'm glad the treasure was magic," Emily said sleepily. "Now we all have everything we wanted." As Grace kissed both girls goodnight and turned off the lights, she reflected on Emily's innocent wisdom. The briefcase hadn't been magic, of course. It had been evidence of love persisting through trauma, hope surviving despair, and the power of truth to eventually overcome even the most carefully constructed lies. But the family they had become together felt like magic, felt like the kind of miracle that only happens when people open their hearts to unexpected possibilities and choose love over fear. 6 months later, Grace and Ethan were married in the garden under Isabella's oak tree, with Emily and Isabella as their bridesmaids and Scout wearing a bow tie as the official ring bearer. Carmen attended the wedding under supervised release, crying as she watched her brother marry the woman who had helped heal the damage she had inflicted. But that was still in the future. Tonight, on this Christmas evening, Grace fell asleep in Ethan's arms for the first time, listening to the quiet sounds of children breathing safely in the next room, and feeling grateful for the mysterious ways that love finds a path through even the darkest circumstances. The buried secret had been unearthed, the lost daughter had been found, and a family had been born from the ashes of old sorrows. Sometimes, Grace thought as she drifted off to sleep, the best treasures are the ones we never knew we were looking for.